Good afternoon and very welcome to today's seminar to be given by Mikhail Khorkov. And it's on the topic Individualization, Subjectivity and Reform, Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians in the 15th century. Mikhail Khorkov studied history and philosophy in Moscow and Karlsruhe and was awarded his PhD in Moscow in 1999. He is Associate Professor of Western Philosophy and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at the Russian Academy of Sciences. From 2001 until 2013, he taught as an Associate Professor of Ancient and Medieval Philosophy at the People's Friendship University of Russia. He has also been a Fellow at the Max Weber Kolleg für Kultur und Sozialwissenschaftliche Studien at Erfurt Universitet in the years 2016 until 2017, and a Senior Fellow at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies in the period 2017 till 2018. His research areas include the history of medieval and Renaissance philosophy, history of religious thought, and phenomenology. And Mikhail's most recent publications include an entry in the Meister Eckhart Yearbook in 2017 on Latin translations of text by Meister Eckhart and their implications. Also, he published the article Harmony of Intellect and Disharmony of Soul in German mystical texts of the late Middle Ages in the journal Mikrologos in 2017. Another recent text of his is entitled Self-Consciousness and Conscience in the Writings of Henry Suso and John Tauler, published in the volume Bakumer Studien zur Philosophie in 2018. He is also the author of a book chapter with the very exciting title How to Make a New Philosophy from an Old Platonism, published in 2014, in the book Georgios Gemistos Plethon, the Byzantine and the Latin Renaissance, and edited by Matula and Bloom. So in his area of research, Mikhail is not only very productive, but he's also strongly involved and engaged in scholarly pursuits to push the area forward. In 2012, he was elected to the board of the International Society for the Study of Medieval Philosophy, and in 2018, he became vice president of the Max Scheele Gesellschaft. And during his stay at SCAS, his research activities are focused on a project dedicated to the study of intellectual controversies between Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians, documented in a number of 15th century manuscripts from Swedish and other European libraries. Most welcome, Mikhail.
Thank you very much for a nice introduction. And also thank you very much that there are so many here at this dramatical moment of the European history. So to me it's already too much people at this seminar. My main research is related in all areas, is related to the study and interpretation of old manuscripts. And today I would like to present to you my new discoveries made in various libraries, including Swedish ones. My story for today's seminar could sound like a perfectly medieval one if it weren't a story about a man who is generally regarded as the most significant representative of Renaissance philosophy. I mean Nicholas of Cusa. Oh, this guy. It's a classical portrait from Bernkastel-Kues. His partners in the intellectual dialogue, which I will talk about were the Erfurt Carthusians, the monks of the Charterhouse Mons Sancti Salvatoris, German Salvatorberg in Erfurt. Picture from the 15th century. Here's the city of Erfurt, and this is Charterhouse. So a church and cells of the monks and a house of lay brothers. That's perhaps the best picture of this monastery. It means that the heroes of my today's story usually don't meet together in the books about the 15th century, especially in the books on the history of philosophy and intellectual culture. It looks as if they belong to completely different worlds and different historical periods. Nicholas of Cusa lived in the Renaissance period, while the Erfurt monks were part of the medieval world. However, it seems to me that the narratives of strict historical periodization overlook in this case the documented fact that the heroes of my today's story lived not only at the same time, but also met each other and spoke the same languages. Their meeting was not at all a marginal historical event, nor was it an insignificant episode with the obviously predetermined meaning of the historical clash between Cusanus' new and progressive Renaissance humanism and, retrograde medieval mystical clericalism of the Erfurt Carthusians, with the inevitable victory of the new over the old. Indeed, they belong to the same board, for which an integrative historical narrative is not only possible, but also absolutely necessary, especially if one assumes that this narrative will be multidimensional. In fact, in my presentation, I will try to show some elements of this narrative, not all of them, not forgetting to mention also the elements I would like to exclude from it. Of course, my today's story could well be considered a case study of local significance, but the content of the texts and the broader context in which they were composed suggest a more universal interpretation that goes far beyond the space and time of the events occurred in this story. Therefore, characterizing the 15th century as a transitional time, say from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance and early modernity, it's good to remember that the notion of transitivity just emphasizes its historical character by virtue of temporality, that generally characterized the essence of history, including the history of philosophy, a small episode of which I will present today in a new interpretation, previously unknown to researchers who were not familiar with the manuscripts I recently found, or didn't pay any attention to the documents that had long been known and available for study. And now the story begins. Nicholas of Cusa contacts with the Erfurt Carthusians began during his legation journey to Germany, 1451-52, when he, sent by the Pope and as his personal representative, visited Erfurt, where he stopped for almost 2 weeks in late May and early June 1451. There he met two of the leading Carthusians, Jacob the Paradiso and John the Indagine, and very likely discussed with them a series of important questions that seem to concern not only practical issues of monastic reform, but probably also theoretical problems of the nature of mystical experience, contemplation, meditation, and the role of philosophy for a contemplative religious life. At least the writings of the participants of these meetings, written around 1450-51, suggest, albeit indirectly, that such a dialogue could actually take place. These texts clearly emphasize the positions of the parties, which have surprisingly many similarities, but at the same time show considerable differences. In the case of Nicholas of Cusa, this is a series of texts written in central Italy during the summer of 1450 and known as the Idiota dialogues. While in connection with Jacob de Paradiso and John de Indagine, I refer to their treatises on mystical theology, not all of which have yet been published. It may seem astonishing that no researcher to date has envisaged a connection between the works of Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians, written around 1450. For some inexplicable reason, Cusanus' legation journey of 1451-52 to Germany and his work on the text of the De Idiota dialogues shortly before it were supposed to belong to different narratives, not to the same story, although in reality they undoubtedly form the same story. As a result, in the vast majority of studies on his biography, the separation between work on the text of the De Idiota dialogues and the legation journey to Germany is a common stereotype, so the two different words. The researchers also never paid enough attention to the visit of Nicholas of Cusa to Erfurt. Although the stay in the city was one of the most important throughout the whole journey. In this context, the current situation in the research literature can be illustrated by a couple of most representative examples. The first example comes from the book written by a German historian of philosophy, Kurt Flasch. The title of the book, Nikolaus von Kues, Geschichte einer Entwicklung. This passage is so wonderful and sounds like a great piece of poetry. So I think it's reasonable to read it in original German language to hear this melody. So, and this is a translation of this text, of this passage. So, now the poetry. Vor der Trockenlegung der pontischen Sümpfe war das römische Klima ungesund. Hinzu kam die Pest. So flohen der Papst und seine engste Umgebung trotz des Jubiläumsjahres im Sommer 1450 in die Marken. Cusanus hatte einige Monate Muße, danach musste er wieder reisen. Von Anfang 1451 bis März 1452 war er auf der großen Legationsreise nach Deutschland. Am 15. Juli 1450 schrieb er in Rieti an einem Tag den ersten Dialog über die Weisheit, De Sapientiae. An 2 Augusttagen verfasste er in Fabriano den zweiten Dialog über die Weisheit. Beide Schriften zusammen bilden den ersten Teil eines Triptychon. Dessen Mittelstück oder zweiten Teil stellt der Dialog über den Geist der Mente dar. Er Er ist im Kloster Valle Castro bei Fabriano geschrieben. Diese Schriften werden dadurch zusammengehalten, dass es sich um 3 Unterhaltungen handelt, die ein Idiota führt. Ein Idiota hieß damals ein Ungebildeter oder ein Laie. So. It's wonderful. It's really poetry, greatly inspired by perhaps Joseph Brodsky or Konstantinos Kavafis. So it's the same aesthetics, I think. So, and at the same time, this passage explains that my today's story is actually a story about the texts written during the epidemic in Rome. So, the second description belongs to Jasper Hopkins. His Cusanus journey during 1451 and the first quarter of 1452 led him to visit such centers of spirituality as the Benedictine monasteries at Melk and Salzburg, the religious congregation at Deventer, Diepenven, and Windesheim, in addition to visiting such centers of episcopal powers as Trier, Mainz, Cologne, and Aachen. We have no reason to believe that the journey of reform led him, when en route from Salzburg to Munich, to make a detour to the Benedictine Abbey at Tegernsee. The Abbey's records inform us only of its expansion of June, between May 31st and June 2nd, 1452. So, a couple of French words make here the influence of this passage, I think. So it's other kind of aesthetics. So it's how people write history. What's mean writing history? There's all these small words and tricks, I would say. Hopkins' position can be viewed as indicative of the situation that has developed in the Cusanus studies, namely that for general interpretation of Cusanus' life and work, the debates between Nicholas of Cusa and the Benedictine monks of Tegernsee in Bavaria, which have been studied in more detail, remain to be of far greater importance than his discussions with the Erfurt Carthusians, although based on the date of Cusanus' stay in Erfurt, they took place much later than his contact with the Erfurt Carthusian monks. These descriptions could be compared to a newer version of the legation journey, written by Watanabe, Christiansin, and Itzbiki, which is also not without a preconceived opinion and one-sidedness that, if disproportionately asserted, turn out to be absolutely inaccurate. So you see here the map of this journey. So here's Erfurt. That is the journey from Italy through Austria, then Bavaria, and Erfurt. Here's the passage, I mean, from a companion. After leaving Spital and the Donau, something after Monday, January 25th, 1451, Nicholas of Cusa went on to Salzburg, Madze, Passau, Wiener Neustadt, Vienna Melk, Lambach, Salzburg again, Munich, Andex, Freising, Landshut, Regensburg, Eichstätt, Nuremberg, Bamberg, Würzburg, Erfurt, and Halle. Most of these places were located within the Salzburg Church province. Actually, they were never located there. very incorrect passage. His activities at these places in the initial stages of his legation deserve close attention. Completely agree. These positions are influential and internationally recognized, and therefore they hardly could have been rejected easily. However, it's not that they are completely wrong in some of their statements, but that they do not notice, and moreover, they neglect a lot of important facts that would be interesting to finally pay attention to. So that is a description of the situation. So, for example, important and previously unknown details about the legation journey of Nicholas of Cusa to Germany can be found in a 15th century Word Chronicle from the University Library of Wrocław in Poland. The prologue to it says that it was composed under the supervision of the Erfurt Carthusian monk John de Indagine. Oh, the monk whom Cusanus met in Erfurt. So, eyewitness. Rara preuditore fratri Johanni Hagen Carthusiansis. That is an introduction to this chronicle. Erfurt is named in the chronicle as one of the most important goals of the whole route, while Tegernsee and Bavaria, which are important in all other descriptions written by contemporary historians, are quite expectedly not mentioned at all. Passage. Anno sequenti Cusa venit quasi cadem via d'Italia per Austriam in Erfordia Magdeburg. The following year, the cardinal from Cusa went to negotiate from Italy through Austria to Erfurt and Magdeburg. So, according to contemporaries, from the perspective of Erfurt, so Erfurt was the most important goals of the whole journey. The time and place of the origin of this chronicle, namely Frankfurt on the Oder, where John de Indagine lived for some years at the beginning of the 1460s. So here's his curriculum vitae. Very interesting person, composed more than 500 texts, and only a couple of texts is published. So the time and place are associated with the beginning of a reinterpretation of the works of Nicholas of Cusa by the East German Carthusians, whose most important intellectual and spiritual center always remained in the Erfurt Charterhouse, followed by their systematic reception. In general, the Wrocław Chronicle contains 6 text passages reporting on the activities of Nicholas of Cusa and discussion some of his ideas on the reformation of monasteries and the practice of indulgences. More than of any one of his contemporaries, including popes, emperors, and kings. Of particular value, obviously, is the fact that John de Indagine personally knew Nicholas of Cusa and met him in Erfurt to discuss his reform plans. Equally important is that John de Indagine himself was then actively involved for many years in the reform of Benedictine monasteries in East Germany on behalf of Nicholas of Cusa. The Word Chronicle from the University Library of Wrocław was never been studied previously, and the information it offers has never been included in the multi-volume edition of the documents concerning the life and activities of Nicholas of Cusa, the Acta Cusana. As for Cusanus, the Idiota Dialogues on the writings of the Erfurt Carthusians from the same time, it should be said that first and foremost, that the attention of their authors is focused on the figure of the wise layman. Very special figure in all these texts. There are many publications on what this figure might mean in the idiotic dialogues from theoretical and historical points of view. I will not go into the detailed analysis here because, in my opinion, they often not only give very abstract answers, but also formulate their research questions in an extremely abstract way. Apparently, this is the case because they do not take into account the specific historical context of Cardinal Cusanus' life around 1450. Of course, one can find many common elements between understanding of the new role of the laity in the devotional movements of the late Middle Ages, for example, Devotio Moderna and many, many other movements. Or in the literature of Italian humanism. So, laymen played a great role in the Italian humanism, in the Renaissance. That's true. So these elements are not completely meaningless for systematic or comparative research studies. But they're still of little help to us in finding a clear answer to the question of why Nicholas of Cusa wrote the Didoto Dialogues in the summer of 1450, when he was preparing to travel to Germany, not earlier and not later. But when we read the texts of the Erfurt Carthusians, which were written around 1450, the answer becomes immediately clear. And of course, one must not forget that when dealing with the Erfurt Carthusians, Nicholas of Cusa pursued not only theoretical, but also and mainly ecclesiastical and political goals. He wanted to gain their support for his plans of an observant monastic reform, which should be implemented in the country where a large part of the clergy, including the Erfurt Carthusians, adhered to anti-papal or conciliarist positions at that time. And Cusanus is a representative of the papal politics. So his enemy, he was regarded as enemy by the Erfurt Carthusians. Here, for example, page from text from a manuscript from the Swedish National Library, text written by John the Indagine, where he harshly criticized the Pope. Passage against the Pope, the Papa. Therefore, the legation journey of Cusanus to Germany must have been extremely difficult and even dangerous. Sometimes it was very dangerous. So that during the summer of 1450, he had to prepare for it very carefully. In other words, in the summer of 1450, Nicholas of Cusa simply did not have the opportunity for a peaceful and relaxing philosophical vacation in the sunny summer Italian province, despite many of our contemporary authors believing that this was really the case. So he was actually quarantined because of plague in Rome. So, at the end of May 1451, some months after the dialogues were composed, Nicholas of Cusa meets the Erfurt Carthusians. When I talk here about the Erfurt Carthusians, I mean, first of all, those of them who were involved in the discussion on mystical theology with Nicholas of Cusa. However, the individualized character of Carthusian spirituality, when each monk spent 6 days a week in his cell, compiling his own collection of meditative texts based on books he had read, the so-called rapiario, personalized collection for meditation. So this character naturally suggested also other forms of individualized spirituality as well. So every monk had practically his own spirituality. Most often they were completely without texts of Nicholas of Cusa, Jean Gerson, and other authors important for discussions on mystical theology. An example of this kind of monastic literature is a manuscript from the University Library of Uppsala. Which originated in the Erfurt Charterhouse. Its anonymous compiler, day after day, wrote for himself passages from the German translation of Augustine's works, the German Augustine, alternating them with Latin excerpts from the works of other church fathers and teachers. So here, for example, on these pages, try to do it in a more accurate way, sorry. So here's a passage from Augustine, Augustine's Soliloquia, in German translation. Before it, on the previous page, a small German passage from Bernard de Clairvaux, very short, and before it, a Latin passage. So that is normal, so it's one passage after other in different languages, so it's personal notebook, I would say. So there's good reason to assume that Cusanus and mystical theology, discussion on mystical theology, have never been the main interests of all the Erfurt Carthusians, but only for a few of them, who, however, have held leading positions in the Carthusians community. So, what distinguishes the position of these leading Erfurt Carthusians, which so attracted the attention of Nicholas of Cusa? In their view, the layman, so the main persons of this text, is much better equipped to understand wisdom than learned theologians and philosophers, since he is humbler than learned people. For example, this idea is frequently repeated in the treatise on mystical theology by Jacob de Paradiso, who was one of the leaders of the Erfurt Carthusians monastery during the visit of Nicholas of Cusa. He also calls the layman an idiot, idiota. So it's synonymous, layman and idiot. And that is exactly what Nicholas of Cusa does in the Idiota dialogues. So that's one example among many, many others. From already edited text. So I wouldn't read the whole passage and translate them from the Latin. So it's enough to show laicus and idiotas. So idiotas and laicus, and then rusticus, it's the same like uneducated man. The second Carthusian, John de Indagine, writes the same way in his works. Thus, in the Weimar treatise on mystical theology, he says that the humble layman understands that truth on mystical theology must either faster, deeper than the man who educated in secular sciences. A quote in Omni sapientia mundi eruditi. The explanation of why this is happening is quite self-evident. Humble people are simple in their intellectual ambitions and do not claim to know more than what they receive directly from God, to whom they are connected in an act of a very affective love. In order to achieve it, thinking must be humble itself. In other words, it must be transformed into unlearned thinking. Only then, through affective love of God, does humble human thinking impart divine wisdom. Therefore, it's not accidental that the encounter with the divine wisdom happens in the valley of humility, in valley humilitatis, where strong human affects become subtle and spiritual, because the effect on which mystical theology is based is a noble effect that has freed itself from all worldly passions. So I quote, Mystica theologia in affecto nobilis consists. I think it's no need to translate it. Affecto nobilius consisted. In another treatise on mystical theology, in the Paderborn treatise, John de Indagine describes mystical theology as an irrational and foolish way that leads uneducated people, or in other words, idiots, to the knowledge of God. In formulating this, he obviously paraphrased Jean Jaussaud and Hugo de Malna and other great authors who were the main authorities for his mythical theology. So that's the quotation. I skip the reading it again, just to show the main important terms. Yeah, irrational and nec per intellectum sed solum per affectum. So the effect is important to attain the divine wisdom. The whole line of argumentation seems to be clear and ambiguous. Mystical experience is characteristically concerned with the rational faculties of the human soul only at its first primitive stage, where at best it works as bad conscience. Mystical ecstasy as such is affective and irrational and has nothing in common with intellectual activity. But the subjective, affective, psychologized mysticism of the Carthusians and universal rational knowledge permanently diverge in completely different directions. To Cusanus, such a conceptualization of the nature of wisdom and the manner of reaching it were completely unacceptable. On the other hand, touching after the important problems of the Carthusian interpretation of mystical theology in his Diotodialogues, he solved the problem of the relationship between intellect and wisdom in a very unique way. The intellect is not simply a possible way to obtain wisdom, among many others, and not only a means to an exercise of wisdom, but it perceives wisdom because it sees it intellectually without any intermediation. So it already have has wisdom. Compared to conception of Aristotle, who describes wisdom in the 6 books of the Nicomachean Ethics as a dianoetic virtue, wisdom, according to Cusanus, is not a virtue, but rather foundation of our virtues. That is, intellect itself, or mens itself, as he calls it. It's difficult not to notice that the whole figure of thought sounds here very Platonic and apparently refers Plato's dialogue Phaedrus. So it's specialists in ancient philosophy, Plato, know it quite well. Unfortunately, it's not yet known with full accuracy when Cusanus read this dialogue of Plato's. But we know that it's preserved in the Latin translation by Leonardo Bruni as part of Codex Cusanus 177 in the Cusanus Library in Bernkastel-Kues. Numerous marginalia written by Nicholas of Cusa himself clearly show that he had to read this Platonic text profoundly. And when one finds in the Didoto dialogues ideas and figures of thought that should be taken from Platonic Phaedrus, it means nothing else but a very probable fact that Nicholas of Cusa must have read Plato while working on his Didoto dialogues. That is around the year 1450. So let me show you an example very briefly of how it looks in the manuscript, in the Plato manuscript that's part of Cusanus' library. Well, it's a copy of original manuscript. Following Plato, Nicholas of Cusa formulates in his dialogue, De Sapientia, his concept of necessity of a direct connection between principle and consequence. This concept became an important argument to supporting the idea of a direct relationship of the soul with God, which was supported by Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians, but with which most scholastic theologians, such as Jean Gilson and many others, all Thomists and so on, sharply argued. There's no intermediation, there's no direct contact between soul and God. Plato namely says that the principle has no external cause because it's the cause for everything that comes after it. It's caused by nothing, but everything comes out of the principle. Therefore, the principle is eternal. It's to be understood as absolute beginning that never ends. So that's here in the manuscript. So this part. So that is a translation of a Plato passage, and Cusanus, for his part, comments on Imagine to this passage. So, again, yeah, very small handwriting passage. Principium aeternum est sostenet. Also, the principle reveals itself to be eternal. In his dialogue De Sapientia, the following passage appears to be a manifestation of this Platonic concept of the principle. So there are many other passages in his writings. Well, this one. So I skip the reading completely. There's translation below the Latin text. Corresponding formulations about principle as an absolute and eternal beginning can also be found in the second chapter of the dialogue, of the second dialogue, the Mente. For example, so it's just one example. So there are actually many dozens of examples Cusanus used massively Plato's Phaedrus in Latin translation by Bruni to compose his De Idioto dialogues. So that means he had to read Plato at the same time. Perhaps not at the first time, but massively, and used it massively. And I read many texts, many other texts, and wrote margins. So there are a lot of margins there. In more detail, I will talk. I hope I will talk about this very special and extensive topic on the 13th of May here in Uppsala at the History of Philosophy seminar. So you are all welcome. I hope it will not be cancelled. And the second part of my book will be devoted to this topic, and it will be also include an edition of translation of Cusanus' Marginalia to Plato's Phaedrus in connection with his De Idioto dialogues. It would therefore be appropriate to confine myself today to a very brief remark that the massive reception of the Phaedrus is most likely the reason why the Idioto dialogues are usually interpreted as Platonic texts written for hypothetical Renaissance Platonists, who in the summer of 1450 simply did not exist among the people Nicholas of Cusa was in contact with, and who did appear in Italy among his Roman friends some years later. So the dialogues were not addressed to the Platonists. They were never, he used Plato, but not for the Platonists. Therefore, it can hardly be considered mere coincidence that Nicholas of Cusa is analyzing in his work in a consistent and comprehensive manner the same philosophical topics about which the Erfurt Carthusians write in their own treatises on mystical theology. And also we do not yet have any obvious evidence that Nicholas of Cusa was familiar with these texts of the Erfurt Carthusians, or at least with their short summaries. We cannot completely exclude this possibility. At the moment, however, it's still a question for future studies. Despite that, it's quite possible to say with good reason that Nicholas of Cusa used the same figure of thought in his dialogues as the Carthusians did. When he writes about the humble layman who understands the depths of divine wisdom and criticizes the scholars that they cannot really understand wisdom because they are self-conceited and do not know true humility. So to compare texts written by the Carthusians with these passages, so it's the same idea written on the same occasion. So please, that is very funny passage from one of the Idioto dialogues between orator and the idiot. And the place is also interesting. So according to this dialogue, orator and philosopher met together in Rome on the bridge to St. Angelo Castle. And the Rome is crowded because it's a Jubilee it's an anniversary year announced by the Pope, so many thousand pilgrims from all the Europe came to Rome, and the plague began there, so the Rome was infected. So, and they decided where to go, together with other people or in another way. And then they decided to go to the layman, who lived somewhere behind the forum, behind the market, according to medieval topography of Rome, so close to market, because he produced wooden spoons. So, and then the dialogue begins, so between these two persons. That's very funny. It's really great literature. Therefore, it's hardly surprising that there are many similarities between the works of Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians. So I summarized all similarities and differences. Yeah. Green indicates similarities, red indicates differences. First of all, as I already mentioned, it's the figure of layman, which is the leitmotif of all the writings mentioned in my talk, both by Nicholas of Cusa and the Erfurt Carthusians. Secondly, there is a key importance of wisdom to mystical theology, to the extent that wisdom unites it with philosophy, other forms of theology, and moral practice. Thirdly, the manner of reasoning from a layman's point of view and critical attitude towards university scholastic approach to mystical theology. Fourth, according to the theories of all three authors, wisdom, regardless of what it is meant by it, is attained directly, immediately, just as the mystical experience knows no mediator between human soul and God. These common elements were hardly accidental. So there is good reason to assume that there is a close connection between these texts as well as between their authors. Certainly, it would be very interesting to know whether Nicholas of Cusa had read Erfurt Carthusian texts, or at least knew about their general content before he wrote his dialogues, and met his opponents in Erfurt personally. It's therefore regrettable that the current state of Cusanus research does not provide a definitive answer to this question. First of all, because the correspondence of Nicholas of Cusa with John the Indagine, which was known to their contemporaries, has not yet been found. But we know that this correspondence was the case from the catalogue of the Erfurt Library. So that is page. So it's a description of one of the manuscripts, and here, as part of the manuscripts, varie epistole recepte a fratre Indagine and abeo misse ad legatum. Legatum was surely Nicholas of Cusa. Very probably, at least. So, and here, varie epistole recepte, so this line. Fratre Indagine et abeo misse ad legatum. So it's librarian's hand. The possibility that this correspondence might be lost forever cannot be completely excluded. So it's not yet found, not yet identified in the manuscript, in the manuscripts. On the other hand, it would be naive to believe that Cardinal Cusanus, who was one of the most important European politicians of his time, was not informed in advance of the position of the Erfurt Carthusians. For him, it was a question of monastic reform in Central and Eastern Germany, and both Papal Rome and Cusanus' personal destiny depended on its success. Therefore, in Erfurt, a key city of the entire region, he sought to find allies who at least shared his views in some aspects and might support his reform plans. In this sense, the Editor Dialogues sent a clear message to the Erfurt Carthusians. Look, they said, we think the same way in answers to our main and most important questions, and therefore we can and should work together. As a result, the Erfurt Carthusians decided to cooperate with Cusanus despite all differences, despite all conflicts, and were charged with overseeing the reform of the Benedictine monasteries in Thuringia and Saxony, and this reform was very successful. A task to which they dedicated themselves even years after the death of Nicholas of Cusa. It was a project for many years. Thus, Erfurt, in contrast to the later catastrophe in Tyrol, so about 2 years after that, Cusanus came to Tyrol, and Tyrol tried to do the same, and it was a catastrophe because he couldn't find allies in Tyrol. Thus, Erfurt was associated with the great diplomatic and political success of Nicholas of Cusa. Unfortunately, this success was undeservedly forgotten in Cusanus' historiography. Why? It's another question. So, summing up my talk, I can say that is not excluded that Cusanus' dialogues were written in connection with the preparation of his legation journey to Germany. It's very likely that they were primarily addressed to the Erfurt Carthusians. That is, they could have been written in the context of his controversies with the Erfurt Carthusians on wisdom and mystical theology. Nicholas of Cusa could not accept their theory of mystical theology as an irrational and affective experience and their understanding of wisdom. At the same time, in his dialogues, he used the figure of the wise layman, which was also typical for the writings of the Erfurt Carthusians and their criticism of university theology and mundane sciences. Faced with the difficult political and ideological situation in Germany, one which required him to be better prepared for his legation journey, Cusanus tried to find arguments in his dialogue with the Erfurt Carthusians that would enable him to attract them to his side in the matter of monastic reform. For this purpose, he used the same figures of thought in his writings of the summer of 1450, which were also typical for the texts on mystical theology of the Erfurt Carthusians. At the same time, Nicholas of Cusa resorted to arguments that did not allow him to abandon his own rationalistic positions. So he found the arguments in favor of direct knowledge of the divine in Plato's dialogues, which his Erfurt discussion partners could not read at that time. Apparently, such a thoughtful strategy helped him to find new, reliable allies among the Erfurt Carthusians for his plans to reform the monasteries in Thuringia and Saxony. But no less important is the fact that at the same time, each of the participants in the discussion had no reason to abandon their main theories. Perhaps this is the reason why the Erfurt Carthusians were able to easily include Nicholas of Cusa's The Idiota Dialogues in their library, when one of the Erfurt Fellows of John the Indagine copied these dialogues of Cusanus and put them together into his anthology of mystical texts. However, that is already another story to which the third part of my book will be devoted, and it would be superfluous to discuss it here. So, more details about all what was said today could be found in my recent publication, which are published already and will be published soon. So that is the list of these publications already prepared and published. Some of them are published, some will be published soon. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.